Hello, this is Mrs. Garple, and in this video we are going to go over solving quadratic equations by using square roots. A couple of things we need to keep in mind. When you have the equation x squared equals d, and d is greater than 0, that means it's positive. We have two real solutions, a positive solution and a negative solution. We read that as plus or minus the square root of d. You can also think of it as we're going to go with the positive square root of d, and we're also going to look at the negative square root of d. So there's going to be two solutions when the value of d is positive. When d equals 0, there's only one solution, and that's because 0 times 0 is the only way we can get 0. So the only value squared that gives us 0 is 0. When d is less than 0, that means when it's negative, it has no real solutions. If you try to take the square root of a negative number in your calculator, it will tell you that there's an error or no solution or something along those lines. So let's take a look at our first example. We need to solve 3x squared minus 27 equals 0. Our steps are the same as if this were a linear equation. We want to get the x squared by itself so that we can take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to start by adding 27 to both sides. That gives me 3x squared equals 27, and then I can divide both sides by 3. So the 3 cancels out on that left side, and we have x squared equals 9. Because 9 is a positive number, we know we're going to have two real solutions. We take the square root of each side. When you take the square root of something squared, you're left with the base of the exponential expression. So x equals, and I'm going to write it as plus or minus 3. The square root of 9 is 3. Again, this means the same thing as negative 3 or positive 3. So let's practice some more. Just like I did with the last example, I'm going to begin by adding 32 to each side. My equation will now be 2x squared equals 32. Divide both sides by 2, and we have x squared equals 16. Take the square root of each side again, and you'll have x equals plus or minus 4. Because the square root of 16 is 4, and because 16 was positive, we have two solutions. Next example, add 8 to both sides. So now the equation is x squared equals 0. If we remember from the previous slide, when we have x squared equals 0, there's only going to be one solution, because the only number squared to equal 0 is 0. And then number 3, I'm going to subtract 3 from each side. Don't forget to carry that negative on the negative 2x. So we have negative 2x squared equals 24. Divide both sides by negative 2. And we have x squared equals negative 12. And as we talked about on the previous slide, when x squared is equal to a negative value, there is no real solution. There aren't any numbers that when you multiply them times themselves will give you a negative number, because multiplying two positive numbers is positive, multiplying two negative numbers is positive. Example 2 is a little different. We have an expression that involves a subtraction taken to the second power. So what we'll want to do here, let me rewrite this so I have some extra room. X minus 3 squared equals 16. We want to, in this case, take the square root of both sides first. So now we have x minus 3 equals, we still have the plus or minus 4 though. And then to get x by itself, I'm going to add 3 on both sides. And when I have that plus or minus, I'm going to show that I'm adding 3 on the front end. So when I get my answer for x, I'm going to do a positive 3 plus 4, but I'm also going to do a positive 3 minus 4. So 3 plus 4 is 7. 3 minus 4 is negative 1. So these are our two solutions. So if we practice this some more, with example C, it's very much like the last example. We're going to start by taking the square root of each side first, leaving us with x plus 7 equals plus or minus 6. This time I need to subtract 7, and I'm going to write minus 7 in front of that plus or minus. That helps me remember that I need to take negative 7 plus the 6, but I also need to look at negative 7 minus the 6. So x is going to equal negative 1 or negative 13. With the second example, before I can take the square root, I should divide both sides by 4. Now, I see that 9 divided by 4. I know that that's not going to give me a whole number, but I also know that 9 is a square number and 4 is a square number. In fact, we call them perfect squares. So I'm going to write this as x minus 3 squared equals 9/4. And then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And when you take the square root of a fraction, you're taking the square root or finding the square root of the numerator and the denominator. So we have x minus 3 equals 9/4 is still a positive value, so we still have that plus or minus 3 over 2. The square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 4 is 2. And then I'm going to add 3 to each side of my equation. And I'll have x equals 3 plus 3/2, or 3 minus 3/2. Now keep in mind, when you're adding fractions, you need a common denominator. The common denominator is going to be 2. So I'm going to multiply that 3, which I've written as 3 over 1, as I'm going to multiply numerator and denominator by 2 to get that common denominator. So now I'm adding 6/2 to 3/2. I am subtracting 3/2 from 6/2. So 6/2 plus 3/2 is 9/2. 6/2 minus 3/2 is positive 3/2. And for the final example on this slide, we want to start by adding the 12. So now we have 2 times x plus 5 squared equals 18. Now this setup looks very similar to our previous example. Next step is to divide by 2. So we have x plus 5 squared equals 9. Take the square root of each side, and we have x plus 5 equals plus or minus 3. Subtract 5 from each side. So we now need to find x equals negative 5 plus 3. We also need to find negative 5 minus 3. So x equals negative 2 or negative 8. Now sometimes we have situations where we won't have a perfect square to find the square root of. We sometimes have to approximate. And you'll definitely need a calculator for that part. So with 2x squared plus 10 equals 32, the first step will be to subtract 10. And 2x squared will equal 22. Then divide each side by 2, and we have x squared equals 11. And then I need to take the square root of each side, so we will have x equals plus or minus, and then in your calculator, find the square root of 11. And it is approximately 3.32. And I'm going to change my equal sign to an approximation symbol because that will indicate that we rounded this answer to 2 decimal places. That's what the nearest hundredth is 2 decimal places. Here we have a storage container, the shape of a rectangular prism. Its height is 6 feet, its length is 2 times its width, its volume is 288 cubic feet. Find the length and width of the container. You'll want to remind yourself that to find the volume of a prism, you take length times width times height. We know the height is 6. We don't know the width. I'm going to call that x. And we know that the length is 2 times the width, so we can say that our length is 2x. And then we are told what the volume is. So now we can plug in these values or expressions to our volume equation. We have 288 equals 2x times x times 6. So I'm going to multiply everything on that right side. 2 times 6 is 12. X times x is x squared. So we have 12x squared. Divide both sides by 12. And we have 24 equals x squared. Take the square root of both sides. And we have approximately 4.9 feet for x, which is the width. Now to find the length, we take 4.9 times 2, and the length is approximately 9.8 feet. And in our last example, we're given the surface area S of a cube with side length A is given by the formula S equals 6A squared. Solve the formula for A. So I'm going to start by writing that equation in a space where I have room to work. Since we're solving for a, that means we want to get a by itself. So I'm going to divide both sides by 6, and our equation will now be s over 6, and I'm going to rewrite that s. It kind of looks like a 5. So s over 6 equals a squared. And then we take the square root of each side, and this reminds me, I didn't bring attention to this on the previous problem. Because we're talking about lengths of objects, we don't need to worry about the negative answer because we can't have negative measurement. So we're now going to have the square root of s over 6 equals a. Approximate the side length of a cube with a surface area of 724 square inches. Since we know that surface area is s, we can substitute 724 for the s in our equation. So we have the square root of 724 divided by 6 equals a. And you can type this whole thing in the calculator. I would just recommend that you have parentheses around the 724 and the 6 when you do it. So in my calculator, I'm going to press the square root, open parenthesis, 724 divided by 6, close the parenthesis, equals, and this is approximately 11 inches. Is the length of one side of our cube. And this concludes our lesson on solving equations, quadratic equations, using square roots.